So this is the fourth lecture on Chapter 2, Neurobiology. In the last lecture, we were talking, or I was talking about some of the significant brain structures and the lobes. And I'd like to just start that, kind of carry on with that in this lecture. Some of the more, and sort of focus my attention on some of the more significant, or the ones that are likely to show up in an exam. One of those is with the limbic system. And the limbic system is actually a cluster of neurological systems. Sometimes I think of it as like a neighborhood. In the limbic system, the two most important characters that are in this neighborhood is the hippocampus and the amygdala. I've already spoken briefly about the amygdala. The amygdala is a fairly, I think they say it's about the size of an almond. And it's a small brain structure, and it's implicated in some fairly basic, the mammalian brain, right? So you have fear, anger, and learning and memory. Now, a couple things that I want to draw your attention to, and especially when we start talking about neurotransmitters, the chemicals, is you should notice there's a theme that, for instance, fear and anger are two emotions, are two responses, neurological responses. They're elevated states of arousal, right? So they're like kind of high energy. And often learning and memory are associated, often structures or chemicals that are implicated in arousal also are implicated in learning and memory. Well, this kind of makes sense if you think about it from the perspective that you have to be alert if you're going to remember things or learn things. And learning and memory are effectively the same thing. All learning is forming memories, and you have to be alert if you're going to form memories and therefore learn something. So to me, there's sort of this theme. The hippocampus is a funky sort of long structure, and in that chapter, I actually have some images of the hippocampus. And what's important for you to remember is that the hippocampus is where this term right here, really important term, neurogenesis. And neurogenesis is a fancy word for creating new neurons, right? When I was in college, we were being told that you didn't create new neurons. Well, that is not true. There's actually a picture in one of my slideshows about the birth of new neurons. And the birth of new neurons happens, neuro, like neuron, and new, neurogenesis, in the hippocampus. It's also logical to me that in the part of the brain that is implicated in memory and implicated in forming new memories is also the same place that you get new brain cells. I think of it kind of like this. If you get new shoes or new books, you got to build a bookshelf in order to put the books on, right? So you need these new brain cells in order to hold on to these new memories. Also in this emotional center, so your limbic system is where emotions happen, where memories happen, and that'll kind of make sense if you think about it for the purpose of survival. There is a cluster of neurons, there's a region that's referred to as the pleasure pathway. And I have a better picture in another slide of what the pleasure pathway is. But this is a part of the brain. So it's memories and feelings, right? And it's a region of the brain that is very sensitive to a wonderful neurotransmitter that we call dopamine. Dopamine is the neurotransmitter that makes you feel good. It's often described as the reward. It's the reward neurotransmitter. It's the one that makes you want to do things again. So right here in this core part of your brain, memories, feelings, anger, but also these wonderful feelings of pleasure that because it's so closely associated with your memories, you're going to remember these feelings of pleasure and you're going to repeat that behavior in order to get these feelings of pleasure. Which is why sometimes it's one of the explanations, if you will, for addictive behavior. Things that feel good, you remember them. But it's also true that the things that are scary, you also remember those too. You're just not regular. It's just not implicated in dopamine. Okay, a couple other important concepts. One is referred to as cerebral localization. And these blue letters here, these are actually video links, and I'll put them up over in Canvas, and you can, I'll create an activity, an exercise for you where you watch both of these. But these are regions in, I haven't talked about that. So the hemispheres of your brain, right? The left and the right hemisphere, and that's actually in the next slide. But the left brain, this is how I always remember, the left brain, and I don't know if that's an L to you or a backwards L, is the hemisphere that's regulated in language. So left brain, language and logic. Your right brain is less logical, more artsy, more, right? But over in the left hemisphere, so cerebral localization means somewhere on the cerebral cortex and all those folds of the brain, there's a location, there's a place that has, is particularly important for certain aspects. This slide is about 2 of these locations on the left hemisphere that are implicated specifically in our ability to communicate in language, right? Language and logic. One of them towards the front, and I'm embarrassed to say I can't always pronounce it. I always call it Broca, right? And this is usually named after the doctor, the scientist that discovered him, or the poor patient that had this problem. And then Wernicke. What researchers have observed that if this region, and it would be, let's see, if your temporal lobe is here, so my right side would be on the right side. If this part of your cerebral cortex is damaged, that it will affect someone's ability to produce speech. So in this video, again, I'll put it in another place, you can tell that the interviewer is asking Randy questions, but Randy seems to be like, it's like, I've heard it described as a chronic tip of your tongue, like it just can't get the words out. Randy can understand just fine, his comprehension is fine, but his ability to produce speech is impaired. This is different than if you're Wernicke. So the point is that our ability to communicate requires a lot of neurological, a lot of brain power. Wernicke, is a little bit further back. When this location on the cerebral cortex is damaged, the person has no problem producing speech. They can make all kinds of words. They can just rattle on making words, no problem. But their words don't make any sense. So there's I believe this one is a gentleman named Leon, I forget his name, and the interviewer is asking him questions, and he appears to understand, and he answers her questions, but they don't make any sense. He's talking about hands, and he ends his interview saying something like, I hope the world is good for you. And it's just like this gibberish, right? So his ability to actually make words, which requires, mouth structure and vocal cords all working in sync, that's fine. But the words that he says just don't make any sense, his comprehension. And so what I ask students is, first of all, I ask you is, and a lot of, if you work in nursing homes or you work with, or people that have strokes or work with elderly patients, you may very well know somebody that suffers from one of these conditions. But I also often ask students to consider that a loved one has one of these conditions, and what do you think would be harder, or what do you think would be easier for you to deal with? Aphasia, which means damage, aphasia to the Broca area or the Wernicke area. I'm going to stop this. I'm going to stop right here, and when I come back, I'll talk about functional specialization and the activity that goes with that next slide.